00 hours. November 15, 1942. The Pacific Ocean is black. The location is a graveyard. The charts call it Savo Sound. The sailors call it Iron Bottom Sound. Because the floor of the ocean is paved with the wreckage of 40 ships. And tonight, the tally is about to rise. On the deck of the USS South Dakota, the air is heavy. It tastes like salt and diesel oil. The humidity is 100%. Men are sweating through their dungarees. They are standing at their battle stations. They are waiting for the muzzle flash that will kill them. High above the deck, in a 40mm anti-aircraft gun tub, a loader stands ready. His helmet is too big. It slides down over his eyes if he moves too fast. His life jacket is cinched as tight as it will go, but it still hangs loose on his frame. He is shaking. Not from the cold, from the adrenaline. He has a job to do. When the shooting starts, he has to feed 4-pound shells into the breech of a Bofors gun. He has to do it while the ship rolls. He has to do it while the world explodes.
The men around him are 18, 19, 20. They are considered the youth of America. But the loader? He isn't 18. He isn't even close. His name is Calvin Graham. He is a seaman second class, and he is 12 years old. He should be asleep in a bedroom in Houston, Texas. He should be worrying about a math test. He should be dreaming about baseball. Instead, he is standing on a floating fortress of steel, about to engage the Imperial Japanese Navy at point-blank range. The fuse is burning, and Calvin Graham has a secret that is just as dangerous as the enemy fleet. If the Japanese don't kill him, the United States Navy will put him in the brig. But right now, the time for secrets is over, because a spotlight just snapped on. To understand how a 7th grader ended up in the gun tub of a battleship, we have to rewind the clock. We have to go back 3 months. August 1942, Houston, Texas. The war was everywhere. It was in the newspapers, it was on the radio, it was in the empty chairs at the dinner table. Calvin Graham was 11 when Pearl Harbor happened. By 12, he was tired of watching. He was 5 feet 2 inches tall. He weighed 125 pounds. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a paperboy. But he had a plan. The plan relied on the chaos of the bureaucracy. The United States military was expanding at a rate that defied logic. They needed bodies. They needed warm bodies to hold rifles and swab decks. The recruiters were tired. They were overworked. They were looking for numbers, not birth certificates. Calvin practiced his voice. He tried to make it deeper. He tried to walk with a swagger. He stole a notary stamp. He forged his mother's signature on a permission slip. He told the recruiter he was 17. It was a lie, a fragile, paper-thin lie. But the recruiter didn't look too closely. Maybe he saw the desperation in the kid's eyes. Maybe he just wanted to go to lunch. But there was one hurdle left, the dentist. In 1942, the military checked your teeth to guess your age. It was a crude science. Calvin knew his teeth would give him away. They were the teeth of a child.
So he got in line behind 2 older boys, 14 and 15, also lying. When the dentist moved down the line, Calvin played the shell game. He slicked past while the doctor was distracted. He blended in. He became invisible. It worked. The stamp came down, accepted. Calvin Graham was no longer a child. He was property of the U.S. Navy. He was sent to San Diego for boot camp. This was the first ticking clock. Boot camp is designed to break men. For a 12-year-old, it should have been impossible. The physical demands were brutal. 10-mile marches, obstacle courses, heavy packs. Calvin didn't break. He learned to hide. He learned that if you kept your mouth shut and did exactly what you were told, the drill instructors wouldn't look at you. He learned to shave, a face that had no whiskers, just to fit in. He learned to smoke, choking on the acrid fumes just to look like the others. He became a mimic, a chameleon in a sea of white uniforms. The other recruits called him Babyface. They joked about his size. But nobody turned him in.
In the Brotherhood of the Barracks, you don't rat on a guy who pulls his weight. And Calvin pulled his weight. By the time he graduated, he was a sailor. And he was assigned to the newest, deadliest weapon in the American arsenal, the USS South Dakota, hull number BB-57. This wasn't just a ship, it was a technological titan. She was the lead ship of her class, a fast battleship. Previous battleships were slow, plodding monsters. They were designed to fight other battleships in a line. The South Dakota was different. She was built for speed. She could hit 27 knots. She was built to run with the aircraft carriers. She was shorter than the North Carolina class, but she carried the same armor. This made her cramped. Inside, she was a labyrinth of steel corridors, pipes, and valves. She carried 2,300 men, a floating city packed into a steel hull. But her real purpose was destruction. She carried 9 16-inch Mark VI guns. These weren't just cannons, they were artillery pieces of the apocalypse. Each gun barrel weighed 192,000 pounds. They fired a projectile that weighed as much as a Volkswagen Beetle. They could throw that weight over 20 miles. When the main battery fired, the concussion was so violent it could distort the eyeballs of the men on deck. It could strip the paint off the steel. Calvin Graham didn't work the big guns. He was assigned to the anti-aircraft batteries. The South Dakota was a porcupine of anti-aircraft fire. She carried 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns. She carried dozens of 20mm Ehrlichen cannons. And she carried the 40mm Bofors. This was Calvin's world, the Bofors. It was a Swedish design, adopted by the U.S. Navy. It fired explosive rounds at 120 shots per minute. It required a team, a pointer, a trainer, and loaders. The loaders had the hardest physical job. They had to stand on the slippery deck and shove clips of 4 shells into the autoloader. The clips weighed nearly 20 pounds. Calvin weighed 125. Every clip was a percentage of his body weight. But he practiced. He built the muscle. He learned the rhythm. Clang, click, fire. He learned to do it without looking. Because if you looked at the enemy plane diving at you, you might freeze. And in the Pacific, hesitation was a death sentence. October 1942. The South Dakota arrives in the Pacific. The destination is Guadalcanal. The Marines had landed in August. They were holding a tiny strip of land called Henderson Field. The Japanese wanted it back. They were throwing everything they had at that island. Troops, planes, battleships. The waters around Guadalcanal were dangerous. At night, the Japanese Imperial Navy owned the sea. They ran the Tokyo Express, delivering soldiers and shelling the airfield. The U.S. Navy was bleeding. They had lost cruisers, they had lost destroyers. They needed heavy metal. They sent the South Dakota. Captain Thomas Gatch was in command. He was a hard man, a believer in the battleship. He told his crew they were going to hunt. For Calvin Graham, the adventure was turning into reality. The boredom of the crossing was gone, replaced by the Condition Z. The watertight doors were sealed, the ventilation was cut to prevent smoke spread. The heat inside the ship spiked. The smell of unwashed bodies and fear filled the compartments. Calvin slept in his life jacket. He ate standing up. He watched the older men. He saw their hands shaking. He saw them writing letters home. Just in case. Calvin didn't write a letter. He couldn't. If he wrote home, his mother might find out where he was. She might call the Navy. His silence was his shield. November 14th. The intel reports came in. A massive Japanese task force was steaming toward Guadalcanal. Their goal? Bombard Henderson Field until nothing was left but ash. Their centerpiece, the Kirishima, a Congo-class battleship. The South Dakota, along with the battleship Washington, was sent to intercept. This was it, the heavyweight title fight. Battleship versus battleship. It was a scenario that naval strategists had dreamed of for 20 years. But there was a problem. The South Dakota was sailing into a trap. The Japanese were masters of night fighting. They had better optics,
They had the long lance torpedo, a weapon that left no wake and could break a ship's back from miles away. And the South Dakota? She was new. Her crew was green. They had never fought a surface battle. And as they entered the narrow channel south of Savo Island, the engineers made a mistake. A circuit breaker tripped. It seemed like a small thing. A switch flipped in the wrong direction. But on a modern battleship, electricity is sight. The radar screens flickered. The fire control computers hummed and died. The South Dakota went blind. In the gun tub, Calvin Graham couldn't see the circuit breaker. He only knew that the ship suddenly felt vulnerable. The massive 16-inch guns, which relied on radar to find their targets in the dark, were now aiming at ghosts. The ship was a 35,000-ton giant stumbling in the dark. And out there, in the black water, the Japanese were waiting. They had seen the American ships. They had their solutions plotted. They were loading their guns. Calvin Graham adjusted his helmet. He gripped the cold steel of the Bofor's gun. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then the sky tore open. It wasn't a flash of lightning. It was a Japanese searchlight. It hit the South Dakota with the brightness of the sun. The boy was exposed. The ship was exposed. And the first shell was already in the air. The secret of his age didn't matter anymore. Survival was the only currency left. The light didn't just reveal them, it pinned them. When the Japanese searchlights hit the USS South Dakota, the darkness of the Pacific vanished. 1 second, Calvin Graham was standing in the shadows. The next, he was standing on a stage. The beam was blindingly white. It washed out the color of the ocean. It made the gray paint of the battleship glow. Every rivet, every cable, every sailor was visible. For the Japanese gunners on the Kirishima, the South Dakota wasn't just a target, it was a practice dummy. They didn't have to guess the range, they could see it. And they didn't hesitate. Calvin froze, just for a heartbeat. The instinct of a child is to hide from the monster. But on the deck of a battleship, there is nowhere to hide. The steel plates under his feet began to vibrate. Not from an explosion, but from the engines of the South Dakota kicking into emergency flank speed. But it was too late for speed. The first salvo arrived. It didn't sound like thunder. It sounded like a freight train derailment. The Japanese shells were a mix of high explosive and armor-piercing. They slammed into the superstructure. They didn't hit the hull. They hit the towers. They hit the radar dishes. They hit the gun tubs. They hit the exact places where the men were standing. This is where the tragedy of the South Dakota becomes technical. It wasn't just bad luck, it was a system failure. Moments before the first shell hit, the ship had suffered a catastrophic self-inflicted wound. The chief engineer had tied down the circuit breakers. It was a standard practice to prevent them from tripping during the vibration of the guns. But something went wrong. A short circuit occurred. Instead of isolating the problem, the tied-down breakers forced the system to overload. The main bus lost power. The gyroscopes tumbled. The electric motors on the gun turrets froze. The South Dakota was the most advanced battleship in the world. And in the middle of a knife fight, she had just suffered a stroke. She couldn't steer, she couldn't talk, she couldn't see. Captain Gatch was on the bridge screaming for power. But the Japanese didn't care about circuit breakers. They poured fire into the wounded giant. In the 40mm gun tub, Calvin Graham was in a world of noise. The 16-inch guns of the South Dakota were trying to fire back, aiming visually at the muzzle flashes of the enemy. Every time the main battery fired, the overpressure wave hit Calvin like a physical punch. It rattled his teeth, it compressed his chest, but he kept moving. Grab the clip, lift the clip, ram it home. The Japanese planes were overhead now, or maybe they were friendly. It was impossible to tell. The sky was a web of tracers. Red tracers from the Americans, yellow and green from the Japanese. They crossed in the sky like a neon lattice of death. Calvin's gun was firing, thump, 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 thump. The empty brass casings were piling up around his ankles. They were hot, They burned through his dungarees. He kicked them aside. He didn't look at the ships burning in the distance. He looked at the breach. He was a machine, a 12-year-old cog in a broken machine. Then the Kurashima found the range. The Japanese battleship was firing 14-inch shells. One of them struck the South Dakota's superstructure near the radar plot. The explosion was absolute. It shredded the steel plating like it was wet cardboard. It sent a wave of shrapnel, razor-sharp fragments of superheated metal spraying across the decks. The shrapnel didn't discriminate. It tore through the anti-aircraft tubs. Men went down. They didn't scream. In the roar of the battle, you couldn't hear a scream. They just dropped. Calvin felt a slam. It wasn't a punch. It was a sledgehammer. He was thrown backward. His helmet hit the steel deck. The world went gray, then red. He tried to stand up. His legs were rubber. He touched his face. His hand came away wet. Blood. Warm, sticky blood. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his jaw. Another piece had pierced his mouth. He was 12 years old. He had just lost his front teeth. But it wasn't a playground accident. The metal was still inside him. Pain is a funny thing in combat. Sometimes it arrives instantly, sometimes it waits. For Calvin, the adrenaline was a narcotic. He felt the impact, he tasted the copper of his own blood, but he didn't stop. He looked around the tub. The other men were down. Some were dead. Some were writhing, holding their stomachs, holding their eyes. The gun was silent. The loader was down. The pointer was down. Calvin Graham stood up. He was dizzy. The horizon was tilting crazy angles as the ship turned hard to starboard. The South Dakota was burning. Fires had broken out on the signal bridge. The flames acted as a beacon. Every Japanese gunner in Savo Sound adjusted their aim. "Get the big one," they signaled. "Burn the battleship." The air was thick with the smell of burning paint and roasting meat. It is a smell that never leaves you. Calvin wiped the blood from his eyes. He saw a shipmate, a man he had eaten breakfast with. The man was pinned. His leg was a ruin. He was trying to crawl, dragging a trail of red across the gray paint. Calvin didn't think about his mother. He didn't think about the lie on his enlistment papers. He grabbed the man's belt. He pulled. He weighed 125 pounds. The sailor weighed 180. Physics was against him. But desperation is a force multiplier. Calvin dug his boots into the non-slip tread of the deck. He heaved. He dragged the man into the shelter of the bulkhead. Then he went back. He found another. He applied a tourniquet. He had learned this in boot camp. Twist the stick until the bleeding stops. He twisted until his hands shook. The bombardment was intensifying. The South Dakota took another hit, and another. 27 major caliber hits in total. The superstructure was being Swiss cheeses. Casualties were mounting, 38 dead, 60 wounded. Calvin was one of the wounded, but he was functioning. He was operating on a primal level. He was a child walking through a slaughterhouse, trying to save the pieces. But the battle wasn't over. The South Dakota was crippled. She was turning away, trying to escape the trap. But the Japanese destroyers were closing in. They were lining up for a torpedo run. If a long-lance torpedo hit the South Dakota now, with her power fluctuations and her fires, she wouldn't just sink. She would capsize. She would take 2,000 men to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. Calvin Graham was leaning against the gun shield, spitting blood onto the deck. He watched the shadows on the water. He saw the wakes of the torpedoes before the lookouts did. White streaks in the black water, coming straight for them. The South Dakota was a floating wreck. Her guns were blind. Her crew was dying. And the executioners had just fired the final shot. Calvin closed his eyes and waited for the impact that would end his short life. But he didn't know that help was hiding in the dark. A shadow that hadn't fired a single shot yet. A shadow that was about to change history. The torpedoes were in the water. The South Dakota was burning. The Japanese gunners on the Kurashima were reloading. They were laughing. They had won. They had crippled the American giant. Now they were going to finish it. They were so focused on the burning ship that they made a mistake, a fatal mistake. They forgot to look behind them. They forgot to check the shadows. Because while the South Dakota was being hammered, another ship was gliding through the black water. The USS Washington, hull number BB-56. She was the sister ship of the North Carolina. She was pristine, she was undamaged, and unlike the South Dakota, her eyes were wide open. Her radar was functioning perfectly. Admiral Willis Ching Lee was on the bridge. He was a sharpshooter, an Olympic gold medalist in rifle shooting. He didn't trust luck, he trusted mathematics. He had been tracking the Japanese battleship Kirishima on his radar screen for 10 minutes. He knew her range, he knew her speed, he knew her course. He held his fire. He waited. He let the Japanese focus on the South Dakota. He let them expose themselves. He waited until the range was 8,400 yards. In battleship terms, this is point blank. It is a knife fight in a phone booth. The Japanese didn't know he was there. They were looking at the fire. They were blind to the dark. Calvin Graham was on the deck of the South Dakota. He was holding his jaw together with one hand. He was watching the searchlights. Suddenly, the darkness behind the Japanese fleet exploded. It wasn't a searchlight, it was muzzle flash. 9 16-inch guns fired at the exact same second. The USS Washington unleashed 24,000 pounds of steel and high explosive. The sound didn't reach Calvin yet. Light travels faster than sound. He saw the ocean light up. He saw the shockwave ripple across the water. Then the sound hit him. It was a crack that split the sky. On the Kirishima, the Japanese sailors never heard it. They were dead before the sound arrived. The first salvo from the Washington was a masterpiece of violence. It was a sniper shot with heavy artillery. The shells arched through the night. They slammed into the Kirishima. They didn't bounce. They didn't glance off. They punched through the armor belt like it was paper. The Kirishima convulsed. Inside the Japanese ship, the world ended. The shells detonated in the magazines. They detonated in the engine rooms. The hydraulic lines ruptured. The steam pipes burst. The Washington fired again and again. In 7 minutes, the Washington fired 75 rounds of 16-inch ammunition. She scored at least 9 direct hits, probably more. She also fired 107 rounds of 5-inch shells. The Kirishima was transformed from a warship into a burning wreck. Her rudder was jammed. Her superstructure was on fire. Her main turrets were knocked off their barbettes. She began to circle uncontrollably. The forensic mystery of the battle was solved in seconds. The Japanese had relied on optics. The Americans had used radar. The Washington had used the South Dakota as bait. It was cold, it was calculated, it was brutal. And it saved Calvin Graham's life. On the deck of the South Dakota, the shelling stopped. The Japanese destroyers turned. They popped smoke. They ran. They couldn't fight a ghost that hit that hard. The silence that followed was louder than the guns. Calvin sat down on an ammo crate. His adrenaline was fading. The pain was rushing in. His face felt like it was on fire. He tried to swallow, but he couldn't. His throat was full of blood. He looked around. The deck was a slaughterhouse. The beautiful teakwood was splintered and stained black. The steel bulkheads were perforated. Smoke rolled across the ship. It wasn't the clean smoke of a chimney. It was the toxic smoke of burning electrical insulation and rubber. Men were crying. Grown men. Tough men. They were calling for their mothers. They were calling for a medic. Calvin didn't call for anyone. He knew the rules. Don't draw attention. Don't let them check your papers. He stood up again. He was dizzy. He was 12, but he was a sailor. He saw a cigarette burning on the deck. He stepped on it. Fire discipline. Even now. The South Dakota limped away. She was hurt bad. She had lost 38 men. 60 were wounded. She had lost her radar. She had lost her communications. But she was floating. The crew began damage control. They patched the holes, they shored up the bulkheads. Calvin joined the line. He couldn't talk, his jaw was swollen shut, but he could carry a bucket. He could hold a flashlight. He worked through the night. He worked until the sun came up over the Pacific. The sunrise revealed the true extent of the damage. The ship looked like it had been chewed by a metal beast. The flag was tattered, but the Kirishima was gone. It had slipped beneath the waves of Iron Bottom Sound. The Japanese had lost a battleship. The Americans had held the line. Guadalcanal was saved. But for Calvin Graham, the danger wasn't over. The battle was the easy part. The battle was loud and fast. The aftermath was slow and quiet. And in the quiet, people start to ask questions. People start to look at faces. They start to notice that the hero with the shrapnel in his jaw doesn't look like a man. He looks like a boy. The ship set a course for Noumea, New Caledonia. It was a repair port. It meant hospitals, it meant doctors. It meant officers with clipboards. Calvin tried to clean himself up. He washed the blood off his face in a bucket of salt water. It stung. It burned like acid. He looked in a piece of broken mirror. His face was a mess. He had lost teeth. His lip was torn. But the eyes staring back at him weren't the eyes of a 12-year-old anymore. They were the eyes of a combat veteran. He had seen the elephant. He had walked through the fire. He thought he had earned his place. He thought the Navy would see his wounds and respect his service. He was wrong. The Navy is a machine. It runs on regulations. It runs on paperwork. And Calvin Graham was a clerical error, a dangerous error. As the South Dakota steamed toward port, the ticking clock wasn't counting down to an explosion. It was counting down to exposure. The hero was about to become the villain. The Japanese couldn't sink him, but a pen and a piece of paper? That was a different kind of weapon, and it was aimed right at his heart. The South Dakota arrived in Noumea. The repair ship Prometheus came alongside. The wounded were offloaded. Calvin tried to stay on board. He tried to say he was fine. "Just a scratch, Chief. I can work." The chief bosun's mate looked at him. He saw the swelling. He saw the burn marks. "Get on the transport, son. That's an order." An order. You don't disobey an order. Calvin walked down the gangplank. He left the safety of the gun tub. He left the only home he had known for 3 months. He walked into the white, sterile world of the hospital. Nurses, doctors, administrators. They stripped him of his dungarees. They took his helmet. They put him in a bed with clean sheets. It felt wrong. It was too soft, too quiet. A doctor came to stitch his face. He looked at Calvin's teeth. He paused. He looked at Calvin's chart. Then he looked at Calvin's mouth again. "How old are you, sailor?" The question hung in the air. Calvin tried to lie. He tried to use the voice. But his jaw was wired. He could only mumble. The doctor didn't press him. He just frowned. He finished the stitches. He walked away. But he didn't walk to the next patient. He walked to the telephone. The seed of doubt was planted. But it wasn't the doctor who broke the story. It was the medals. News of the South Dakota stand had reached America. The Battleship X story was front-page news. The Navy wanted heroes. They wanted to pin medals on chests to sell war bonds. Captain Gatch recommended his men for citations. Calvin Graham was on the list. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, for meritorious service and wounds received in action. The Navy loved it. A young hero, a brave face. They didn't know the truth yet. But fame is a double-edged sword. When you stand in the spotlight, everyone can see you, including your mother. Back in Texas, a woman was looking at a newsreel, or maybe she just got a letter. The details are murky, lost in the fog of family secrets, but the result was clear. She knew where her son was, and she wasn't happy. She wrote a letter. It wasn't a fan letter. It was a torpedo, and it was heading straight for the Department of the Navy in Washington, D.C. The Battle of Guadalcanal was over. The battle for Calvin Graham's honor was about to begin, and this time he didn't have a battleship to protect him. The letter arrived in Washington. It moved through the pneumatic tubes of the Navy Department. It landed on a desk. A clerk opened it. He read it. He probably read it twice. My son is 12 years old. In the military, there are crimes and there are embarrassments. A deserter is a crime. A spy is a crime. A 12-year-old boy fighting a battleship duel and winning a Bronze Star? That is an embarrassment. It makes the recruiters look incompetent. It makes the officers look blind. It makes the system look like a joke. The reaction was swift. It was cold. It was bureaucratic. The order went out: detain and discharge. Calvin was still recovering. The swelling in his jaw was going down. The stitches were itching. He was proud of his medals. The Purple Heart, a symbol of blood sacrificed. The Bronze Star, a symbol of courage under fire. He wore them on his chest. They were heavy. They felt like armor. Then the MPs came. They didn't come with a handshake. They came with handcuffs. Well, not literally handcuffs, but the feeling was the same. He was summoned to the office of the Provost Marshal. He walked in expecting a commendation, or maybe a transfer. Instead, he saw his enlistment papers on the desk, and next to them, the letter from his mother. The officer didn't look him in the eye. He looked at the paperwork. Is this true, Graham? Calvin looked at the letter. He looked at the officer. He could have lied. He could have denied it. But he was tired. He had survived the South Dakota. He had survived the Hiroshima. He was done fighting. Yes, sir. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. He was no longer a hero. He was a fraud. He was a liability. They stripped him, not of his clothes, but of his identity. They took the medals. You weren't authorized to receive these. They took the ribbons. You weren't authorized to serve. They took his rank. You are not a seaman. You are a civilian minor. And then they delivered the final blow. They didn't just send him home. They put him in the brig. Brig time is hard time. For a combat veteran, it is an insult. For a 12-year-old boy, it is a nightmare. He was locked up in Corpus Christi, Texas. He was surrounded by actual criminals, deserters, thieves, brawlers. They looked at the kid. What are you in for? I lied about my age. That's it? And I fought at Guadalcanal. The prisoners respected him. The guards did not. To the system, he was a problem that needed to be erased. They kept him for 3 months. 3 months of confinement for the crime of volunteering to die for his country. While he sat in a cell, the war raged on. His shipmates on the South Dakota were fighting in the Atlantic. They were fighting in the Pacific. They were heroes. He was a prisoner. The injustice burned hotter than the shrapnel. Finally, they released him. But they didn't give him an honorable discharge. They gave him a dishonorable discharge. This is the mark of Cain in the military. It means you failed. It means you are disgraced. It strips you of benefits. It strips you of voting rights. It strips you of respect. They kicked him out the front gate with nothing. No disability pay for his jaw. No GI Bill for school. No thank you. He was 13 years old. He was back in Houston. He went back to school, 7th grade. 1 month, you were loading 40mm shells while Japanese battleships fire at you. The next month, you were sitting in a wooden desk learning about fractions. The other kids were playing tag. They were complaining about homework. Calvin sat in the back. He was silent. He had seen men blown apart. He had seen ships burn. He couldn't relate to them. He couldn't talk to them. He was an alien. He dropped out. Of course he did. School was meaningless. He tried to work. He was a welder, a shipyard worker. At 14, he was welding Liberty ships. He got married at 14, divorced at 15. He was living a lifetime in fast forward. The war ended in 1945. The parade started. The confetti fell. Sailors came home to kissing nurses and cheering crowds. Calvin watched from the sidewalk. He had no uniform to wear. He had no medals to display. He was a ghost of the victory. But the fighter in him wasn't dead. At 17, he did something incredible. He enlisted again. This time, legally. He joined the Marine Corps. Maybe he was looking for redemption. Maybe he just missed the structure. He served for 3 years, but his back was broken. Not from the Marines, from the South Dakota. During the Battle of Guadalcanal, when he was thrown against the gun tub, he had fractured a vertebrae. He never complained, he never got it treated. Now, years later, his body failed him. He fell off a pier during training. His back gave out. The Marines discharged him. This time, it was a medical discharge, but because of his dishonorable record from the Navy, the VA denied his claims. They said his injuries were not service-connected, because according to the Navy, his service on the South Dakota never happened. It was a catch-22 of cruelty. You were too young to serve, therefore you were never there. Therefore, your broken back is your problem. He spent the next 30 years in pain. Physical pain from his jaw and back, mental pain from the erasure of his history. He worked odd jobs, he struggled to make ends meet. He watched war movies where John Wayne played the hero. He knew the real script was different. The real script was messy. It was unfair. But he didn't give up. He started a writing campaign. He wrote to congressmen. He wrote to senators. He wrote to presidents. Most of them ignored him. The records are sealed. The case is closed. But Calvin had the stubbornness of a battleship. He kept firing. In 1976, Jimmy Carter was elected president. The political winds shifted. The country was looking back at Vietnam. They were thinking about how they treated veterans. A journalist picked up Calvin's story. The boy hero. The veteran who never was. The public was outraged. How could America treat a war hero like a criminal just because he wanted to fight? The pressure mounted. The Navy started to sweat. They opened the file. They looked at the dishonorable discharge. They looked at the Bronze Star citation. They realized how bad it looked. In 1978, 36 years after the battle, the phone rang in Calvin Graham's house. It was the government. They were ready to make a deal. But deals with the government are never simple. They offered him an honorable discharge. They offered to restore his medals. But there was a catch. There is always a catch. They would give him the paper. They would give him the medal, but they wouldn't give him the money. No back pay, no disability benefits for the years of suffering. Take it or leave it. Calvin looked at the offer. He was broke. He was in pain. He needed the money. But more than that, he needed his name back. He needed to know that when he died, his tombstone wouldn't say dishonorable. He took the deal. He got his medals back. He held the Purple Heart in his hand again. It was the same piece of metal, but the ribbon was new. He pinned it on his chest. He looked in the mirror. The boy was gone. The old man was there, but the eyes were the same. The eyes of the loader on the South Dakota. He had won the battle, but the war for justice, that was still ongoing. Because the government had admitted he was a hero, but they still refused to pay for his broken back. He had one more fight left in him, and this one would go all the way to the grave. He had survived the Japanese Navy. He had survived the U.S. Navy brig. Now, he had to survive the final insult, being a hero who couldn't pay his medical bills. 1988. Hollywood calls. The story of Calvin Graham was too good to stay buried in a VA file cabinet. It had everything: action, betrayal, a child hero. They made a movie, Too Young the Hero. Ricky Schroeder played Calvin. Suddenly, the ghost was on television screens across America. Millions of people saw the story. They saw the boy lying to the recruiter. They saw the blood on the deck of the South Dakota. They saw the handcuffs. Public opinion is a powerful weapon. It is stronger than a 16-inch gun. The Navy could ignore a letter from an old man in Texas. They couldn't ignore a primetime movie. The phone at the Graham house started ringing again. But this time, it wasn't just reporters. It was politicians. Senator Lloyd Benson of Texas took up the cause. He looked at the file. He saw the injustice. He saw a man who had been used by the system and then discarded like a spent shell casing. Benson introduced a bill. It was a specific piece of legislation designed to fix a singular wrong. It was a battle of ink and stamps. But in Washington, paper fights are harder than steel fights. The Pentagon pushed back. They argued about precedent. If we pay him, they said, we have to pay all the underage enlistees. They were worried about the budget. They were worried about the floodgates. Calvin Graham didn't care about the floodgates. He cared about his rent. He cared about his back. He was living on Social Security. He was struggling. The pain in his spine was a daily reminder of the night the lights went out in Savo Sound. The fight dragged on. 1988 became 1990. The Soviet Union fell. The world changed. But Calvin was still waiting. Finally, the breakthrough came. The General Accounting Office did an audit. They looked at the dental records. The irony was perfect. The teeth. The same teeth that almost got him rejected in 1942 were now the evidence that saved him. The records proved he was there. The records proved the timeline. The government conceded. They admitted that his back injury was service-connected. They admitted that he was entitled to disability benefits. The victory was absolute. Or was it? The government is a machine that calculates in cold numbers. They calculated his back pay. They didn't calculate it from 1942. They didn't calculate it from the moment he was discharged. They calculated it from the moment he filed his latest claim. The check arrived. It wasn't a lottery win. It wasn't a fortune. It was $4,917. $4,917. That was the price of a childhood. That was the price of a broken back. That was the price of being a hero. Calvin held the check. He could have been bitter. He could have thrown it in the fire. But he didn't. He cashed it. It wasn't about the money. It was about the admission. The check was a receipt. It was the United States government saying, we were wrong. But the victory came with a shadow. Time is the one enemy you cannot defeat. Calvin Graham was tired. His heart was failing. The stress of the war, the stress of the poverty, the stress of the fight, it all took a toll. November 6, 1992, Fort Worth, Texas. Calvin Graham died. He was 62 years old. He died in his sleep. It was a quiet end for a man who had lived through the loudest night in naval history. He didn't die a wealthy man, but he died a veteran. At his funeral, the flag was draped over his coffin. The military was there. They played taps. The notes floated over the cemetery. Day is done, gone the sun. It is the saddest song in the world. But for Calvin, it was a lullaby he had earned 50 years earlier. 2 years after his death, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The Department of Veterans Affairs approved the Purple Heart benefits for his widow. It was the final stamp, the final approval. The file was closed. So, what is the legacy of Seaman Calvin Graham? Why do we tell this story? Is it just a curiosity, a believe it or not factoid? No. It is a mirror. It reflects the desperation of 1942. We forget how close we came to losing. We forget that the United States wasn't always a superpower. In 1942, we were losing. We were desperate. We needed steel, we needed oil, and we needed blood. We needed it so badly that we looked the other way when a 12-year-old boy stepped onto a battleship. Calvin Graham wasn't the only one. There were thousands of underage soldiers in World War II. Some say as many as 200,000. They were 15, 16. But 12? 12 is different. 12 is a bicycle. 12 is a comic book. 12 is not a 40mm anti-aircraft gun.
Calvin Graham represents the loss of innocence on a national scale. He gave up his youth so that others could keep theirs. He saw things that no child should see. He felt the heat of the fire, he smelled the burning oil, and he carried those ghosts for the rest of his life. Today, the USS South Dakota is gone. She was scrapped in 1962. They cut her up with torches, they melted her down. The steel that fought the Hiroshima is now part of a bridge, or a car, or a skyscraper. But in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, there is a memorial. They built a concrete outline of the ship. They planted grass where the deck used to be. It is a ghost ship on the prairie. If you walk there, you can stand where the gun tub used to be. You can stand where Calvin Graham stood. You can look up at the sky. It's quiet now. No searchlights, no tracers. But if you listen closely, you can hear the echo. You can hear the rhythm of the Bofors gun. Thump, thump. You can hear the voice of a boy trying to sound like a man. Calvin Graham was the youngest vet. He was the baby vet. But on the night of November 14, 1942, he wasn't a baby. He was a giant. He stood his ground when the world was ending. He did his duty. And in the end, that is all history asks of us. The bureaucracy tried to erase him. The laws tried to deny him. But the truth has a way of surfacing, like a wreck rising from the deep. Calvin Graham is no longer a secret. He is a testament to the fact that courage has no birth certificate, and that sometimes the smallest soldier casts the longest shadow. This has been a Restricted Archives investigation. The file is now declassified. The record is corrected. Rest easy, Seaman Graham. We have the watch.